worked with county managers, town managers, city managers many times in the past, and I hate to admit this to you at the beginning, but I used to be an elected official. I'm sorry. But that was a long time ago. You too? I know you. I know a couple people in this room. All right, so think outside the box. It's a worn-out cliche. We've heard it 1,000 times. We get tired of hearing it. But the truth behind it is there's some real serious content there. And what nobody ever says when they say think outside the box is how. So what this is about is how. Whole system thinking. Whole system thinking for an integrative solution. And that's what the whole focus of this thing's going to be. So, I've also noticed that people in your business are almost never shy. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and be not shy and interrupt and ask questions. And again, you can remember that I was once an elected official, so you can sort of take that out on me if you want to a little bit. So I'm totally up for that. I've got really thick skin. So in this sort of great local government drama, I think you all maybe have the toughest role. You get people elected who don't have any idea why they're there. And they were the next guy on Rotary that was, whatever. Or they're a one-issue candidate when they ran. Or they're just frightened because they don't understand what's going on. Some of them think that their job is to assert positions, not to figure out a solution. You ever notice that? Almost always. That's not the definition of leadership. So I'm saying this by way of empathizing with the situation that you all are in. So let me just ask you a personal question. How many of you would prefer if maybe one or two of your elected officials was abducted by aliens? So okay, I just want to check there. So now see, there's nobody could see you, there was no photo, so you're... Now, of course, I'm overstating. You also have elected officials who are smart and committed and understand what they're doing and can make it really an exciting job. And some of you, hopefully, are in that kind of a position there, too. So I think the kinds of things that I'm going to suggest this morning are going to be useful for just about all of them, except for the ones that are really terminal, and you know who they are. So I've spent about 40 years searching for more effective ways for groups to make decisions, to solve problems. I've done that in a lot of different contexts. Local community groups, elected boards, business groups, engineers, academics, Indians, lots of different circumstances. By the way, the academics were the worst of them all. Right? They were horrible. So starting in '75, I was one of those single-issue candidates, and I became a county commissioner up valley from where we are right now. So it's a little mining town. You might have heard of it. So there's ski there now, sort of right up that way. Yeah, I was there for quite a few years as a county commissioner. And the county manager, when I first got elected, really ticked me off. He kept asking me why I was there. Well, why would he ask that? I mean, isn't it obvious? Well, bloody no, it wasn't. And the truth, he was a real thorny guy, but he really taught me a hell of a lot. He's long gone now. So also for about 20 years, I worked in lots of small communities all over the country, probably 40 different states, primarily focusing on collaborative problem solving and sustainable economic development and sort of the nexus of those things. Community design, often. I wrote a book about it back in '97. And I also, for Rocky Mountain Institute, and I'll tell you in a moment who they are, I also ran sort of internal corporate workshops that are on specific problems like energy efficiency in an industrial process or a building or those kinds of things. Rocky Mountain Institute is up in Basalt, It's also in Boulder and Washington and Beijing and New York, but we started right up in Basalt. We've got a brand new building up there. If by chance you're about to do a new building in your jurisdiction, or to renovate an existing building, and you want your staff and your electeds to see that efficiency, a net zero energy building, a net zero water building is a real thing. It's not a future thing. It's not a fantasy. It's a real thing that, by the way, reduces costs long term and reduces your carbon footprint. Give me a call. I'll give you a tour. I've been doing it for lots of different jurisdictions in this valley, and we love to show the thing off. That's part of the reason we, Rocky Mountain Institute, do that. By the way, I say we, I've been working for him for 33 years. I work for him part-time, but I'm doing this conversation as an independent, what I call a community diplomat. That's a term that I've coined. And if you like much of what you hear, I've got a website, and it's called Kinsley Diplomacy. My last name, Kinsley, KinsleyDiplomacy.com, and you can get a bunch of stuff on there. So I do mediation facilitation. I just got back from a mediation in a Caribbean country yesterday between the government and its a big American corporation that they're at loggerheads with. So I'm going to start with a simple story. It happened right here in this valley. At that time, there was still a real interest, truth is there still is a real interest, in building a rail system that connects that little ski town up the valley to Glenwood and other locations. A rail system, we've literally been talking about that for 43 years in this valley. But at that time, it seemed like it was going to happen. So one of the things we did was to ask each of the jurisdictions in the valley to say where the alignment ought to be as it goes through their jurisdiction. So in Basalt, the town council picked a committee to look at that. And so I wasn't picked. I'm not in that jurisdiction. I'm right outside of the jurisdiction. But I wanted to see what they were thinking about. So I showed up to the meeting, and conversation got underway. It was a lot of people I knew there, and old acquaintances and old friends. And so they talked a little bit, well, let's make sure that the rail comes and stops in a place that's within easy walking distance of downtown, and let's make sure that when the kids get out of school, they don't run out in front of the tracks, and let's make sure that and they sort of talked about that for a while, and they talked about, well, I wonder what wildlife impacts there might be, and how about noise? And so the conversation went on for, I don't know, hour and a half like that. They'd wander into one topic a little bit, talk about that, and sort of wander off into another topic, and then maybe come back to this one, and then get into the weeds in this one. And somebody was writing down the information, and they sort of got nowhere. This may sound familiar to you. That's kind of the way we usually do stuff in communities. So we sort of wander around, wondering where we're going to go and not deciding on particular issues and going through it stepwise. So finally, I kind of couldn't hold my tongue, and I said, look, can I ask you all a couple of questions? And I felt kind of comfortable doing that because I knew a bunch of people in the room. They said, oh, sure, we don't seem to be going anywhere. So I said, so first of all, let me see if I heard you right. Somebody said that safety was a real question. So and by the way, realistically, there were only 3 possible alignments. It was a narrow valley. There's only 3 particular places it was even plausible to put a rail alignment. So I said, with regard to deciding among those 3 rail alignment possibilities, what question should we ask ourselves about safety? So I wrote that question, okay, that question about safety. It says, and then you mentioned something about access to downtown. They came up with a question, and another one on wildlife, and a whole bunch of different questions that they came up with that were just, in effect, a reiteration a clarification of what they'd been talking about for quite a long time. So I said then, okay, I see that, okay, I see you got this question, you got that question, and so the room got kind of quiet, and then I said, and as they began to talk, I just sort of quietly grouped them together. I actually didn't do it the way I said, right? So there was a couple of questions about community and safety, and I put those in this group, and there were some environment questions, and I put the environment questions down there, and there were sort of economic questions, and I kind of put them here, and just in sort of three rough categories. So I said, okay, I understand that. So then I said, all right, so what if we were to think about each of those questions separately as against the three alternatives? You know, there's alignment A and B and C. So with regard to that safety question, if you compare A, B, and C, which one of them seems like it's really not going to be, it's really a positive thing from a safety standpoint? Yeah, that one. And they answered that question sort of as in a consensus, and they thought that B was really terrific from a safety standpoint, and they thought C might be a problem. And then they talked about wildlife a bit, and they said, well, this one is going to be a wildlife problem, so we think that pretty good chance that elk are going to come out of the hill right there next to the alignment. And the other one, well, we're sure the elk's going to come out, so we put a double negative on that one. And rapidly, in the period of about a half an hour, they filled out this whole chart. I'm just asking them questions, and they come to a quick consensus about what their response might be in each one of those. And in some cases, there was the particular criterion or factor didn't apply, and I just write not applicable. Or we didn't have enough information, so we might put a question mark in that particular box. As soon as we got all the pluses and minuses, double plus for looks really good, double minus looks really bad. As soon as we got all those pluses and minuses on the board, they knew essentially immediately which alignment to choose. It was obvious which they would choose. They did so. Somebody later then developed a written recommendation, and they felt really satisfied about what they did, and they'd actually had fun doing it. And there was very little contention in the room because they were dealing with sort of objective questions. And then there was certainly some subjectivity here, and a couple of them we never really got to a consensus on a couple of the boxes. So I kind of put a circle around it when, well, we're not sure how we feel about that one. But the weight of the information that they could see, because, you know, for instance, just hypothetically, that this one had a lot of positives on it, and this one had a lot of negatives here, that it was obvious that they were going to go with A. And they felt really good about that decision. They then, as they walked out of the room, they were really kind of fun and excited, and a lot of people stuck around and talked excitedly, and they were so pleased that with their accomplishment, that they frankly hardly noticed that I'd had any role in it, which to me was a huge victory. For me, a great facilitator is like a butler, invisible. You just get the job. Of course, how many of us know what a butler? I've seen it on TV, right? Watch Downton Abbey, right? So, but I heard somebody say that one. Another way of talking about that is it's called servant leadership. A lot of you have heard that, Jankowski, and some really great work that's been done around servant leadership. There's been volumes written about that. So I think this is sort of one sort of practical, deeply practical manifestation of me being a servant leader to that group. That if you asked them they wouldn't even tell you that I was in the room. They wouldn't have noticed, because it was their decision using their values, their criteria. So they felt really terrific about that. So, and I also know that was a relatively simple question, relatively. And you're dealing with some that aren't nearly that easy to get hold of, and there's greater subjectivity. I want to fully recognize that this doesn't work for every difficult decision, but it can be really, really powerful. So what they had done, I want to suggest, is they had worked strategically with the whole system in mind. Rather than, if that conversation had continued to wander, somebody who was maybe more assertive in the room would have gotten a hold of one issue, access to downtown, and dwelled on that, and people would have got tired of the damn meeting, and they said, okay, let's do the one that's closer to downtown. Have you noticed that happen in some of your, yeah. That's kind of the way somebody, especially, and this is the way I think about it, because having been on a board for 10 years, you know, when the easy problems come in, even when they're big, if the solution is obvious, those are easy. And you've seen your board just blow through a question like that. But when it's a close call, when it's really complicated, it's scary. It's kind of like, if I can use the word, sort of the fog of problem solving, and you kind of go blank. So when somebody who is assertive and smart in the room says, this one's got close access to downtown, let's do this one, you go, okay, let's do that one. That's not strategic. It's a default kind of a decision. And in our local communities, we do it all the time. Another thing, by the way, if your board is really into transparency, what can be more transparent about decision making than something like that? You've got the basis for the decision right there. Now, some people don't like that kind of transparency either, but it can be very powerful. So they'd use their goals, not my goals. I just asked the questions. In addition to being a really powerful and simple tool, simple to understand, it's also I would assert, it's the essence of sustainable development. We've all heard that word a lot. I've been in that business for 30-odd years, and I hardly ever use it anymore because it's so damned vague. What does that mean? And often what it becomes is a way of one group to beat up another group. Well, you're not as sustainable as I am. Or it becomes a list of do's and don'ts or wrongs and rights. To me, the essence of sustainable development is whole system thinking for an integrated solution. A solution that integrates, remember we talked about that these were community factors, these were the economic factors, and these are the environmental factors. Community, economy, environment, the essence of sustainability. That's what the definition of sustainability is the not the balancing of one of these against the other. You know, let's get balance in our decisions. We hear that all the time. Balance is getting one at the expense of the other. Integration is finding a solution that works as well as possible for both or all three sets of considerations. So what might we do to improve this tool? Maybe some of you have already used, I didn't invent this, I just sort of put some specificity on this. What might we do to improve it? Well, let's think, and I'd like your ideas about how to improve it. It would be really, really helpful for me. But let's just say that these three alternatives, that there might have been more than just those three alternatives. Those are just three that we began, in this particular case there were only three realistically, but in some other decision there were three that were posed initially. But as we got through it, you know, we saw this one was looking really good, but boy, there was a big negative down here. It was a double negative. Wow, that's a big problem. So maybe there's a way to redesign A to fix that problem, and that becomes D. D becomes very similar to A, but it fixes that problem. So it not only becomes a way to decide among given alternatives, it becomes a creative way to derive new alternatives. And by the way, it's really fun to do this too. Did you believe that part? I got some nods. Okay, great. You know, because it's not so messy and foggy. It's about using whole system thinking about the whole system, which we really haven't talked about much, and we'll get more into that, to integrate community, economic, and environmental considerations. And corporations are doing this, communities are doing this, it's happening in a lot of places very quietly, and not balancing one against the other. I also kind of think of this as sort of instant strategic planning. What is more strategic than basing the decision, an important decision, on the values of the community? Because ultimately those questions were about the community values. That was sort of the nature of the conversation. We value our children. We don't want to get them squashed by the train, right? To be absurd about it. But we also value our wildlife. So it's a way. And we often think of strategic planning, you've probably all been through strategic plans, that can take months, years. And sometimes that's necessary. You've got a lot of different things to consider. This is a way to actualize it on a very rapid basis. And I would go further to say that, again, an assertion on my part, that I don't think that planning is genuinely strategic unless it deals with the whole system. Unless it looks for full integration of all the factors that can realistically be considered. So let's then get into that definition of whole system thinking. Yes, sir.
I was going to make a comment that in the military, what you're describing, they sometimes call that the military decision-making process, MDMP.
They use this matrix thing?
Very almost exactly to the T.
Those guys stole it from me.
The one thing that they do different is we call it on the criteria, on the EPA, the safety, the downtown access.
These being criteria,
call those criteria
or factors, yeah.
And the top row is, across the top is your courses of action.
Yeah, so it's sort of criteria and courses of action or options or alternatives, yeah.
But on the criteria, sometimes if there is something so important, we put an additional factor in there, so a ×2 or
So it's a really good point. So if this particular one is particularly important, you might put a 3x or a 2x on it. Now that gets into, I mean, you notice that I use pluses and minuses. You could use numbers in here. The danger in using numbers, in putting a value in each one of these, and in weighting each one of these, is that then you end up with a number at the bottom of each one, as if that number has, let me suggest, too much power. Because it's easy for us to defer to the damn number. Sometimes you need to do that, especially if one factor or criterion is dramatically more important than the other. So yes, indeed. So I would just suggest try doing it without the numbers, just because it's really about consensus, not adding up numbers. There are exceptions to that. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, our council did that.
Oh, good.
And we had visionary sessions 5 years ago, and it took 3 years to prioritize them, and we did the numbering. Exactly this.
Great.
Yeah, and they did get stuck on the darn number. And then they were fighting which one, because they were referring to the number as priority number 1, priority number 2.
Oh, interesting.
But in fact, it was not. So it was just like, oh, very, very upsetting. But yeah.
That's interesting.
I
So
agree, the numbers.
So they fought about it because of the numbers. So then what happened to that argument?
Well, we had a new council as well.
So you're trying to get rid of these morons, and then you get another set of morons, right?
Yeah, no, it's a mess.
Okay. Sir, Darren, you had something.
I think a good touch back on why the military does that, in that it's usually based on what a single person, the commander's priorities have been established, right? So you're right. I think we just put pluses and minuses. You're trying to build consensus versus you're trying to meet the commander's intent. So it's probably a little bit different between the two.
Well, it's different in ultimate intent, but it's a similar structure. How many of you all are ex-military? Yeah, I've noticed a lot of people in your business.
Yes, you did steal this from the military.
I'm sorry? I did. Oh, no, they stole it from me. I'm much older than they are. No. Thank you. Yes, sir.
The only thing I thought of is to make sure if you have a list that you make sure all those are equal, or at least you signify.
All the criteria are equal?
Because, well, the way it's set up, it looks like the economic part, the environmental part, those are the same, but if one actually is more valuable than the other, it should be marked that way. If the more valuable part is, all the pluses, and the less valuable is the minus. Because if you have a bunch of small things that don't matter, but it looks like on there it's just all pluses, then you might end up picking the wrong one.
Yep, that's right. And that's your judgment call. Mainly what this is about is not precision. It's about focusing the conversation. The conversation that I walked in on was really muddy. How many muddy conversations do you have with your board? It's about focusing the dang conversation. Now, you can take it the next level and develop some precision here, but that even to, as your name, as Linda says, it can be a little dangerous for the reasons you frame. So it's a judgment. You guys make judgment calls all the time. So let's then look at some whole system aspects of the basalt meeting. For example, one principle I would submit of whole system thinking is collaboration. It's something that you all know very, very well. And for me, that collaborative context had been created before I walked in the room, so that wasn't relevant there. But who would you choose to have? Let's say we're starting back, and you're on the council, you're the town manager there, and you're about to deal with this problem with the rail alignment. So how would you decide who you would invite to come to that meeting? On what basis? What are your criteria? Anybody?
Those that are affected.
Say again?
Those that are affected.
Those who are effective. Who are affected? Did you say effective or affected? Affected with the A, yeah. Thank you. Well said. Right on it, yeah. Those who are affected. What else?
You have to invite the defective ones too.
Well,
They're left out of the process, they're going to be added.
yeah.
The definition of collaborative.
Yep. Yep. Who else? Yes, sir. He comes from DOLA? Oh, so we just, you can just disregard that, right? I don't want to talk to the state guys. Yeah. Yes, sir.
One of the methods I've used is basically to take a lesson from the private sector and create focus groups and actually proactively invite, this is effective, I'll call it that. The people who don't attend, don't think they're involved, don't even know what we do. And I've actually done it at a very broad scale, listing like the Rotary Club to go to the voter registration list and start calling people and say, we want you to come in.
Yeah.
Help us solve this problem.
Yep.
And not only do you get much richer decisions, because now you get people who care, but they don't engage normally. They're busy raising kids, or for whatever reasons, they're just not involved. But not only do you get richer decisions, but now you have an outreach to a section of your community that normally doesn't know what you do, isn't engaged in what you do,
Yeah.
care what you do, and
Yep.
all of a sudden they find out why they should care.
So I've noticed that people in your business have gotten a lot better at collaboration over the last couple decades. I used to do some speeches for ICMA, and you all are way more sophisticated. Of course, that was a while back, but the kind of points you made, let me suggest is sort of a simple way of looking at it. Like what Beck said, who is affected. So I think another word for affect is influence. So those who will be influenced by the result, the outcome, is one. Second is those who will influence the outcome, whether you like it or not. Those who are influenced, those who will influence. And lastly, those who have direct experience of this issue, even if they don't care about this particular argument or decision, the fact that they have experience working with the thing. I mean, for instance, at Rocky Mountain Institute, we worked on redesigning tractor trailers to make them more energy efficient. We had truck drivers in the room, not just engineers, guys who drive the trucks, people who drive the trucks. Just as one example. So those with experience, those who will be influenced, and those who have influence. And then from each of those, think of them as categories, as groups, even if they're not organized. There'll be a neighborhood here, and there'll be an interest group there, but there'll be another group that maybe is not organized. And then think about, from each of those hypothetical groups, or sometimes real groups, which particular individual tends to be thoughtful and diplomatic. So invite and recruit the diplomats, not the warriors. The warriors are going to show up to a public session. But in terms of recruiting people to participate, especially if it's a committee you're reporting, look for the diplomats, not the warriors. The diplomats who the warriors respect and who can, in effect, speak for those warriors, though you don't want to have them sort of representing interest groups per se. That's the hard part, is if they're in there to represent a position, the conversation is much more difficult than somebody who is in there to articulate the interests of that group. And you want to encourage those diplomats, again, to reflect the interests of that group, not assert the position of that group. That position and interest thing is a relationship that's talked a lot about in negotiation technique and mediation, with central to mediation technique. Somebody comes in with a hard position, and what we need to do is discover what the interests are. If we have a conflict going on, we can't resolve the conflict at the level of positions, because that's, I want A and I want B. But why do you want B? Why do you want A? And those interests are the basis to find not common ground, but intersecting interests. Common ground sounds like we got to all be friends and love one another. Intersecting interests is your interests and my interests at that point intersect, and we choose at that point. This is what Peter Senge, S-E-N-G-E, Peter Senge, who is maybe the guru of whole system thinking, a brilliant guy. And by the way, if you need a speaker about this stuff, the guy is fantastic. He's also expensive, but he's worth it. Peter Senge has written a whole bunch of books about this. The Fifth Discipline is one of them. But Fifth Discipline's a little turgid. He wrote a really great book called The Necessary Revolution. And one great thing about the Necessary Revolution, Peter Senge, is that he tells stories there about deeply collaborative processes, not within local government, but in a broader context. And he calls that getting the whole system in the room. Because there's a strong tendency when there's a genuinely diverse group of people in the room, the result tends to be more sustainable than it otherwise might be, because you're more likely to get community and economic and environmental considerations if you have more than just 5 old white guys in the room, which is the way we used to always make decisions, right? It's the way our towns and counties used to be run. 5 old white guys decided what to do. Fortunately, we've left that behind, but that's one of the reasons we have so much difficulty. It was kind of easy when the old boys decided, right? They decided, we moved on. But now it's really messy. This democracy thing is really messy. So we're becoming much more democratic, and it's much more of a challenge. Get the whole system in the room. It is collaboration. There's a whole lot of people in the collaboration business, and they do all kinds of process stuff. Some of them are terrific, and some of them are not. And they think that we all just got to get together and hold hands, and everything will be wonderful. And so they work entirely on process and relationship. Working on process and relationship is critical, and it's insufficient unless whole system thinking in some form or another, that's just a word I'm using, that different people use different words. Unless it's a rigorous conversation, the collaboration is worthless. So bring rigor into collaboration. One other point about collaboration. So I've got this great solution to our problem, and Greg, I want you to sort of help me implement my great solution. Does that sound like collaboration? And of course, we do that all the time. Not necessarily you, but that happens all the time. Oh, well, we talked to all those people. So, yeah, we talked to them and them and them, so we collaborated, right? Wrong. The only time collaboration is genuine is when it starts before a solution is identified. That was collaboration because there were 3 options, but they didn't decide anything first. The group collaboratively developed a solution. Collaboration takes place before the solution. It's a critical component. The next principle is solve the right problem. It sounds bloody obvious. Solve the right problem. And we do that by asking questions, asking the right questions. In order to seek systemic causes of a problem, we ask why. That kind of is also related to what I was saying before about positions and interests. In order to discover the position, we ask why, to discover the underlying interests so we can have a real conversation. This, by the way, again, is nothing new. It comes out of Deming's thinking and what's the term for it? I've just blocked. The management system, continuous improvement. It's central to continuous improvement is the whole idea of asking why. And if you get on the get on the web and search for the 5 whys, you'll get like 100 different YouTube videos, all the way from stuff that's really awful to some really interesting stuff, to get down to the 5 whys. Because it's such a very, very powerful tool. So here's an example. 30, 40 years ago, during the energy crisis, which some of you are too young to have even noticed, which sort of, we had like lines at gas stations, and it was real crazy, and Jimmy Carter wore a cardigan and said it's a moral equivalent to war. And what most of us were doing, I'll bet you were doing what I was doing, which was, oh my God, we're running out of oil, or oh my God, we're running out of electricity, so we got to get more. So what are we going to get? Well, we got to get some nukes over here, and we got to get some photovoltaics over here, and some wind over there, and get some more oil from the Middle East, and we got to go down there and make sure that in the Middle East that the politics are okay so we can continue to get their oil. Very messy. So that's what most of us were doing. Well, there was one guy, one real heretic named Amory Lovins, who I've now worked for 33 years, and he asked a different question. He didn't say, where do we get more supply or how do we get more supply? He said, what is each particular use to which we put the energy, and how do we fulfill that use in the least expensive way? Seems like a really obvious question, right? Nobody was asking that at the time. It's called end-use least cost analysis. And that's a really powerful way, and this is just its application in the energy field, but it applies much more broadly. Because he then, in asking why, in going to the underlying interests, I don't need big cans of gooey black stuff. I don't need electrons coming through the wires. What I need is cold beer and warm showers. Right? So what if I get a more efficient shower head and it takes a whole heck of a lot less electricity or propane or whatever to heat my shower? And by the way, one of the things that he discovered was in almost all cases, efficiency, that is avoiding use of supply on a BTU or kilowatt hour basis or whatever the basis you happen to be, was virtually always less expensive. That goes to the design of buildings, to the design of automobiles, to industrial processes. It goes across the board. And you can read a lot about that on Rocky Mountain Institute's website if you're keen to get into that. So when confronting a challenging problem, always dig deeper by asking why. Now, so you know the next one really too well, and that's there's too much traffic. So what's the obvious solution? What? Bigger road, of course. Add more lanes, obviously. But those of us who have been around a while notice that when you add lanes, the problem just comes up later. So fortunately, and you know this a lot better than I, so it goes something like, so why is there so much traffic? Why is there so much? I'll ask why. So because everybody's driving their own car. Well, why are they driving their own car? Well, the bus is too slow, or it's dirty, or I don't think it's safe, or I got to haul a lot of stuff. But each one of those goes to a different set of solutions. Each one of those reasons not to take the bus, that's just one set of solutions, goes to a different set of solutions or a different track. So, well, the homes are so far away from work. Well, why are the homes so far away from work? Well, because residential prices near work are not affordable. So why are residential prices so close to not? So that then gets us into a different set of solutions. Now, this is all obvious stuff to y'all, but maybe this framework and as a way of thinking about it helps illuminate what you can develop as a much broader set of solutions. So instead of one solution, more lanes, you've got a whole range of solutions. It's more complicated, touches more interest groups, maybe can anger more people depending on the circumstances. It's more complicated, it's more challenging. But that's why we now talk about mobility, hopefully in a lot of cases, instead of just traffic. So let's solve the mobility problem, which is a whole range of opportunities, not just the traffic problem. I'm not suggesting this approach is easy. Mobility is a huge and complex problem. But in general, when your board is considering one of those decisions that may be short-sighted, you know it's coming. It may be short-sighted, it's going to be short-term, it's going to be narrow-minded, is ask why. Ask to dig. Now, that can be very difficult. It can be very confronting, like the way I reacted to my town manager 40 years ago. Why is he asking me why I'm here? Why is he doing that? And sometimes, and this is I have a conflict of interest in the following statement, sometimes it makes sense to farm out that tough decision-making process and get somebody like me, or there's lots of other people, to help you with that. And by the way, if you've got a real thorny one you're coming up on, give me a call. We'll talk it through, just to talk about it. So sometimes you have to look for ways to soften that why. So why do you want to do that can be a really confronting, you're right, obviously. And you know how you have to soft pedal your conversations with your board. So you think of different ways of framing the question. Instead it's why, sometimes you use who, what, how, and where kinds of questions. So what are the underlying reasons for this problem, you might say to your council person, or what are you trying to achieve with that idea? Those kinds of softer ways. But the whole point is do dig deep. Keep asking why in some form or another. And when they do arrive at a particular solution, ask them if there's other ways that might achieve the same goal. Kind of like D over here. Are we stuck with A, B, and C? Well, maybe, but maybe there's a D. So can we at least brainstorm for a moment what other possible solutions are, and then compare those other possibilities as against our goal. Third principle is to optimize the whole system, not just the individual parts. Optimize the whole system, not the individual parts. Example, the sewer system manager. His responsibility is black water and gray water. That's my problem. That's what my job is. All the other issues are somebody else's. Clean water is not my question. Cleaning water is my question. Now, he says that city decisions that increase the flow into his facility, that's somebody else's problem. He's just obligated to figure out how to treat it. And there's a lot of people who are really good at that, and they do it well. They do it as efficiently as possible. And that's kind of normally the way we balkanize, we divide up into individual parts the decision-making and the problems within our communities. Okay, that water thing, that's not my problem as town manager. That's the water district. And the sewer thing, that's his problem. And the sewer guy says, no, that's a water guy's problem. And that's the way we often do it. And people are protecting their turf. But what if instead the sewer system manager, what if she instead considered the larger system? And she said, well, she began quantifying for the city council, who she doesn't work for, but she began quantifying for the city council the marginal O&M and capital costs to the sewer system of additional subdivisions or each additional whatever that's proposed in the particular community. for a fiscal analysis? What if she suggested ways to reduce the amount of water that's used in toilets? Now, that's a thing that was revolutionary a few years ago, but now is part of new building codes, although there's still even better water efficiency opportunities out there. What if she asked the city to allow gray water recovery systems in buildings like we have in our new building, Rocky Mountain Institute's new building in Basalt? Not yet legal. It will soon be legal, and ours isn't hooked up yet. We just plumbed for it, and we're going to hook it up as soon as it gets to be legal. So that's thinking about the whole system instead of that narrow approach. Easy for me to say, hard for you to talk sometimes, depending on the personality of that sewer system manager. Another example, a brilliant, and that last one was hypothetical, though you've seen it before. The brilliant young engineer designed a solar-powered trash compactor. Well, when I first heard about that, a solar-powered trash compactor that sits outside, right? That sounds like a green gimmick to me. It's got costs an arm and a leg. I forget how much they cost, but they're very, very expensive. How can he possibly get a city or a college campus to buy one of those dang things? Well, he was a brilliant engineer who figured out, and he was really into gadgets. He wanted to work for NASA, and he couldn't. But he said, well, my job is not finished. I need to think about the system in which this gadget might work. So he began to look at that system. So what other costs are associated with municipal trash cans or campus trash cans all over the place? Well, mess from overflow, vermin, the cost of pickup, trucks, people, fuel. And so this thing, by the way, this gadget's called a big belly trash compactor. He's a funny guy. It has a sensor in it that tells you when the thing is full. So now you only have to send the truck out to a given trash can when it's full. So that means the route for the trash collectors is different every time based on where the sensor tells them to go. So they save a heck of a lot of fuel and people and ultimately trucks by picking up only when it's necessary. Ends up his really expensive trash compactor are saving campuses and municipalities a heck of a lot of money. His business boomed during the recession, selling these super expensive, and they got the solar electric cells on the top, so they look really interesting. Big belly solar. Here's a guy who didn't just optimize his part of the system. He'd already done that by developing this really cool gadget. He looked the way it fit into the whole system. So if you're thinking about programming, if you're in the process of programming a new building or programming a renovation of a building, and you're thinking about some of this energy efficiency stuff, normally what you do is you ask your architect and your engineers to give you a list of all the things that they might do. So they might do super insulation, sophisticated windows, next generation thermal mass, air barrier material, air-to-air heat exchangers, exterior sunshades, solar electric cells, and then so you ask your engineer to list all of those and put the price on each one of them, and you're probably going to ask him to put the payback time for each one of those. That's called value engineering. Well, the payback time on this one is really long, so we're going to cut that one. On this one, this is really expensive. We just can't take that capital hit, so we're going to drop this one. That's optimizing individual parts of the system instead of the whole system. It's also called value engineering. If instead what you look at is the cumulative cost of all of those components and what the cumulative potential savings is, then you've got a whole system analysis. By the way, we call that tunneling through the cost barrier at Rocky Mountain Institute. And by the way, that's part of what's called Factor 10 engineering. For those of you who have engineering backgrounds or just end up doing a lot of engineering by default, get on rmi.rockymountaininstitute, rmi.org, and search for Factor 10 engineering, and you'll see there's 17 principles of integrative design or whole system thinking. And but some of what I'm talking about here, I kind of stole from that list. So By the way, that building that we have in Basalt that I told you about that you can come visit, 15,000 square feet, 6,500 feet, has no furnace and no air conditioning system. Has no furnace and no air conditioning system, 15,000 feet. Because it has all of those other components that I described, we looked at that whole system thinking, looked at all the possible ways, what are the particular uses to which the energy would be used to provide comfort in that building, which is what you don't want hot or cold air blowing in the building. That's not what you need. What you need is comfortable occupants. So we used 12 different ways to make the occupants comfortable instead of blowing hot air and cold air on them. A whole system solution. Another principle is start with a clean sheet. Often when we're solving a tough problem, we go to well-worn solutions, rules of thumb, sometimes it's called, a previous and a familiar approach. Instead, start with a beginner's mind. That's the invitation. Start with a beginner's mind. Set aside conventional methods and assumptions. Emotionally and professionally, this is very hard to do. But what if you could, for example, the conventional wisdom tells us that if housing prices are too high, well, then we need to build more supply. Let's get some more subdivisions, or let's build taller buildings. That, of course, it's a supply and demand, right? Well, that works, except when you have a very successful city or town where there's high demand, what economists call inelastic demand, and in effect, an inflationary economy. That's the kind of economy that I was a county commissioner inside of, where there's large numbers of buyers, second homeowners, wealthy retirees, speculators, who can always outbid local working people, even the doctors. Then supply ain't going to do it. The truth is, I don't know how you do what I've suggested with your particular board. How do you question assumptions? So what if you began to develop, think about this for a moment. What if you began to develop a culture within your staff and on your board where you started questioning one another's assumptions and really change, okay, let's not call that an assumption, let's call that a hypothesis, and let's test that hypothesis. That's a really rigorous approach. So you notice I'm bringing not only the human stuff and the emotional stuff and the personality stuff, but also the rigor and the science and the engineering into this kind of whole system thinking. So the next one is to reward desired outcomes. Sounds obvious, right? But do you do that? Do you reward people for taking the time and the risk to think about more interesting, more creative solutions? Or do you reward them for taking the conventional solution? I'll just leave that as a question. I'm not sure exactly how you might do that. So the next stage in a decision-making process, you've developed prospective solutions and you're honing those down. Then next, the sixth point then is to ensure that those solutions are durable. Durable. It's kind of another word for sustainable. It's almost a synonym for sustainable. That is, and when we did this, we integrated economic and community and environmental considerations. One of the things that we did was to appeal to different constituencies. If we think about it, sort of a real Machiavellian political view on it. It's a much more durable solution politically. It's also more durable because it's more likely to work because we considered a wide range of solutions. The seventh point is to explore long-term effects and unintended consequences. Again, that one kind of sounds obvious, but do you do that when you're asking what-if questions? That's what we do in mediation. When you have a really tough conflict and people start to talk to one another and coming up with a solution, okay, we're done, let's get out of here, because it's uncomfortable. Same thing with your board. They got a hard decision. They're starting to come to a conclusion. Okay, we're done. Let's go home and watch TV. I mean, do you feel that in the room when you're working? Okay, now we can go. We're done now. But you got to ask what-if questions. Well, what if this happens? What if this happens? What-if questions can be very powerful. And similarly, the eighth point is exploring potential barriers. Okay, we've come up with A as a solution. What are the barriers to A? Now, we did that indirectly by these categories, but we probably weren't thorough. We didn't, well, unless we're geniuses. So when we get to A as a potential solution, we then go through a process, and it can be very rapid, of saying, what are the possible things that can go wrong? What are the unintended consequences? What are the barriers to that actually happening? That then gives one a more rigorous blueprint for how to get to the solution, because you're dealing with what the real barriers are that are likely to come up. So you've come up with your selected solution. Another component of it is to identify multiple benefits. For example, when we talked about efficiency, energy efficiency in buildings, well, one of the obvious benefits, and the one I talked about, is it saves long-term costs. Sometimes saves short-term costs as well. That is energy costs. Well, one of the things that people in the green building business discovered about 15 years ago is that the occupant satisfaction, whether it's employees or whoever is using that building, the occupant satisfaction created more savings than the direct energy savings through lower turnover, higher productivity, and a whole range of other effects on humans, which sounds really soft and mushy. It's been studied extensively. You get more benefit, you get more dollar benefit from an energy efficient building, from staff savings and staff productivity, than you do from the energy savings. And even the energy savings are enough to make it worth doing. So, multiple benefits. Multiple benefits also can help you discover other constituencies, so it can also be just good old Machiavellian politics of showing other people why this solution you've come up with is a good idea. And the last point is to include feedback in the design of your solutions. I can't tell you how many decisions I made as a county commissioner that we made and didn't look back. Okay, that'll be fine. We were really smart. We came up with it. Did we ever measure whether it worked? No, never. What if instead we looked at the objectives that our solution was supposed to fulfill, and we put metrics on those objectives? Now, you can't do that with all objectives, obviously, but put metrics on the objectives and then measure the effect of that thing over time. A very rigorous approach. Again, bringing rigor into this approach. By the way, that's where the sustainable indicators movement, you guys have maybe heard this or even used it in your own jurisdiction. One of the great cities to use sustainable indicators all the way into their budgeting process is the city of Santa Monica. Years and years ago, they developed a bunch of indicators of sustainability. Again, the sustainability are the very community, economic, and environmental considerations. And they developed indicators with regard to each of those considerations to notice whether they were making progress in each of those areas. And particular indicators. I mean, Seattle, they had the birth weight of babies, because it turns out that metric points to a whole wide range of health effects in a given community. And they also used the salmon count in the river, because that indicates a whole wide range of things about the health of that river. So they used surrogates, kind of miner's canary kinds of measures, and they use that in their budgeting. Each year they look at those indicators when they're deciding about their budget. Can you imagine that kind of rigorous budgeting process? You can get on the Santa Monica's website and check that out. So again, I'm not suggesting that any of this is easy, but I do know that each of these components works. And again, you can get that paper off of my website, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, both showing what didn't work about the things I'm suggesting. Tell me what did work. Tell me what you're doing that's working better. Michael J. Kinsley, Michael J. Kinsley, Kinsley, Michael J. Kinsley @gmail.com. And you can get on my website, and it's on there too. So I'd really love to hear how you guys are doing with this stuff, because you're in the trenches. So start chipping away and introducing maybe just one of these approaches that you're not already using. Some of you, as you notice, are already using some of these ideas. So this is not like all brand new stuff. But the opportunity here is to significantly strengthen the decision-making in local government, not just in your local government, but much more widely to avoid the mistakes that the unintended consequences that we so often fall into. And most important, to develop genuinely creative and innovative and sustainable solutions. Thanks. Appreciate it. Strike the word questions. I want to make it a conversation. We're in this together. I'm not like the guy who knows this stuff, right? We all know this stuff together. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so if we were to try to do something like this approach that you have here on the post-it, the first step would be to develop the criteria on the vertical axis. So is that something that we do through the discussion? So that's kind of the first thing, like what are the things that are important to this group? And then you put those up? Or would you come to the conversation with a set of criteria?
Well, of course, that's one of those, it depends, right? Like the colonel may have already told you what you're going to use, right? Or the commanding officer. And you probably don't have a commanding officer, hopefully. Or maybe you're the commanding officer. Good. Good. Again, it depends. But let's just say, notice how it happened in the room with those people talking about the alignment. What I said was, okay, we all know that we're sort of stuck with three possibilities. So what do we need to think about with regard to this problem or opportunity? What questions do we need to ask ourselves when deciding where to put the rail? So first of all, tell me what or tell me what economic questions. That will help the group a little bit. Okay, so we want to make sure it's near downtown so people can come and buy their stuff or walk or get to work easily. Or maybe that's a community. Now, of course, there's no hard line between that which is community and that which is environmental considerations. It's just to get it up on there somehow. So, community considerations. What are community considerations? So, let's make it safe for the kids. What are environmental considerations? And somebody says, make sure the elk don't get squished. So, it's just asking those questions. What environmental considerations? What economic? And tell me if I've been unclear about that. Is that?
Yeah, I was just wondering how those criteria are derived.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like the group gives you those criteria, and then you're going to add those to the tool.
Yep.
And I think someone had mentioned earlier, well, what if it's kind of a little thing? So I guess the group, or something that's maybe not as important to everybody. So I guess you have to kind of weigh that.
What if the criterion is little?
Or just, it's one person's idea.
Yeah.
So I guess that's part of the group facilitation, is just making sure that everyone does buy in, that is an important criteria that should go on here.
Or you might not want to have that argument.
You were actually, opposing weighted decision criteria before, right? You don't like the idea
Well,
of weighted decision criteria.
Yeah, whether you weight the criteria is your call. Obviously, it's your call. And there's a real value in weighting the criteria in the ways that you all talked about, to make sure that its full weight is considered. The downside is the one you described. If you weight the criteria, you probably have to put numbers in the cells and not pluses and minuses. So let me suggest you try it with your staff before you do it in front of your board and blow it. Because you all know that your staff thinks you're geniuses, and you don't want to erode that impression. I know this guy from a long time ago. Tom Hale, of course. Are you still alive? He and I were county commissioners at the same time. That shows you how old he is.
I assume this is the process that Donald Trump uses?
Oh, yeah. Donald calls me every day. And he said, you're a loser.
Have you used this with federal government and not-for-profit?
Sure. Oh, yeah, this applies to any circumstance. You can use it in any circumstance. This is not a government thing. This is a group thing. Okay. There's a hand. Yes, sir.
You have to have buy into the process. You don't have.
You have to have buy-in to the process. What do you mean?
Single individuals don't come in and blow the process up.
Like what?
Which we have all the time. A city council member who comes in and says, there's one issue that's going to take precedence here, If you don't have a strong facilitator that helps make that process happen, it'll blow up quickly.
Do you all hear that? Could you, if you got one person who's really obnoxious and feels like it's their role in the world to be the Donald Trump on the board, sorry about those of you who are Donald Trump fans. I know there's probably a lot of folks. He's a wonderful human being. But so what do you do about, so sometimes, and this is hard, and again, okay, conflict of interest for me is you might want an outsider to help with that really hard one. An outsider that can bring down the hammer on that guy who is such a pain in the ass, who you happen to work for. Yeah. And that, you all are in a really hard position. I've said that 6 times already, but I've never been in your place. I've just seen it happen. And I have the greatest empathy for y'all. I mean, I've met so many town managers who are idealistic, and others who are hard, Machiavellian, and none of them showed up to this session. And I can see how they can end up being that way after a lot of years of keeping their head down to keep their job. I can't, it's hard to argue with that. Yes, sir.
So do you have some rules to engage in fierce conversations?
So what do you do with that fierce, I use a taser with groups. It works with, yeah. It's a facilitator model taser, so it doesn't give you quite the jolt, but it does put them on the floor. I'm being facetious about an important, this is such a whole other conversation about facilitation. I teach facilitation too. Yes, ma'am.
The best way that has worked for us anyways, I bring experts to present to a study session and just present the issue from that point, and then they ask questions. Or, not only would they try to engagement, the city council engage them if they're not cooperative, but there are a few council people that will start the conversation, and then those that don't want to end up, however.
So why do you think that the expert makes the situation work better?
Part of it is because as a staff member, I have to present them all of the issues. The pros and
Impartially.
cons, right, everything. So I try to put a vision in front of them of what the organization is going through. And then they do since they're the experts, they'll assess that, and then they know how to present it back.
So,
I have to be biased, and that's really hard to do.
oh yeah, it's a crucial question, and each one of you have different experiences with that, and that's one of the possible solutions. There's a whole raft of things. By the way, the taser is the best one, but go ahead. Yes, sir.
Reasons not to work, I'll just say.
Reasons not to work.
What model do you use to get people to be creative in dealing with that, rather than just say,
Obstructionism. Using one criteria and the rest of them are meaningless, in effect. Well, if that person who is asserting that particular point of view, well, if there's enough people, maybe it's the community's will to not do the thing because of the damned elk. Maybe that's the right outcome. It might not be the one that you want or that I would want. I don't know. But maybe if you were using this particular technique, then you might want to default back to the weighting exercise that one of our former military friends suggested in the beginning. Do you really think that elk is 10 times more important than kids running out on the tracks? And I can talk about that at length, so you'll put you to sleep. See you all.